can't trust the Air Force. The people at my table want me to announce that the last they heard, the score of the game is 21-10 in favor of USC. Hopefully they won't do anything stupid, but I retired from USC. I can bet on them. There have been wonderful things written about Francis Marion. And tonight we have an opportunity of hearing Judge Turbeville introduce us and perform the song of Marion Smith.
I wanted to sing this song, but I failed the audition. George told me I couldn't do anything but read the poem, but then he comes and he says, "You want the lights on?" I said, "George, I can't read in the dark." Anyway, this is the song of Marion's Men by William Cullen Bryant. Our band is few but true and tried, our leader frank and bold. The British soldiers tremble when Marion's name is told. Our fortress is the good green wood, our tent the cypress tree. We know the forest round us as seamen know the sea. We know it walks of thorny vines, its glades of reedy grass, its safe and silent islands within the dark morass. Woe to the English soldiery that little dread us near. On them shall light at midnight a strange and sudden fear. When waking to their tents on fire, they grasp their arms in vain, and they who stand to face us are beat to earth again. And they who fly in terror deem a mighty host behind, and hear the tramp of thousands upon the hollow line. Then sweep the hour that brings release from danger and from toil. We talk the battle over and share the battle's fall. The woodland rings with laugh and shout as if a hunt were up, and woodland flowers are gathered to crown the soldier's cup. With merry songs we mark the wind that in the pine tops grieves, and slumber long and sweetly on beds of oaken leaves. Well knows the fair and friendly moon the band that Marion leads, the glitter of their rifles, the scampering of their steeds. 'Tis life to guide the fiery barb across the moonlight plain. 'Tis life to feel the night wind that lifts his tossing mane. A moment in the British camp, a moment and away, back to the pathless forest before the peep of day. Grave men there are by broad Santee, grave men with hoary hairs. Their hearts are all with Marion, for Marion are their prayers. And lovely ladies greet our band with kindest welcoming, with smiles like those of summer and tears like those of spring. For them we wear these trusty arms and lay them down no more, till we have driven the Briton forever from our shore.
Thank you, but I was looking forward to hearing you sing it.
I'll come do that.
One of the real joys of the symposium over the years has been that we have gotten to know Dr. Joe Stukes and his lovely wife, Courtney, And Joe has presented many times here, and we've enjoyed them all tremendously. He is, and I hope you read, those of you who came late, the assignment for the people today was to always read the information. Joe is the retired professor, Professor Emeritus of History from Francis Marion University. He is the 2009 recipient of the Governor's Award for Contributions in the Humanities. And what really impresses me, he is a Chautauqua lecturer. And those of you who have heard him before know that he has been Francis Marion, arguing with B'nai Charlton in hell. And that was one year. He also had an argument with Thomas Sumter one evening. One night he was just Francis Marion. Another night he talked about the history and what they had with Buddy, his slave, and talked about his life. He also has been here as John Rutledge and Henry Lawrence, and last year as Major John James. And so tonight we'll have another real treat, and would you welcome Dr. Stukes as Otho Holland Williams.
All right, dear. I'll be just a minute with these visitors. Now you take care of the children. Well, welcome here to Maryland. I hope you had a good trip. I usually sit out here on the porch. Oh, we built this porch this last year. That's the Potomac River out there. You know, I laid out this town. They call it Williamsport. I call it Williamsport. You can get on your ship down there in the Potomac, and you go by Harper's Ferry, and you can go by the new place that George Washington picked out to be this capital of the United States. And I think about that some. You know, it wasn't always the United States. I was born here in these parts. My father died when I was young, and I got put out by my mother, and I was raised by one of my uncles nearby. He had his own land. And you know, they tell me I'm supposed to sit, but I have so often been in a ditty, I just can't sit very long. And that probably means our visit's not going to be very long, but you know, when I sit out here by that lovely river, my mind gets carried back to when I was young. I did live with my uncle. And then when I was in my late teens, he died. And I had to come back to the farm or else go to the city, one or the other. And so I went to Baltimore because I didn't like farming. And I was sort of given to, I like to read books, but mainly I kept financial books for people. I was a clerk, and I enjoyed being a clerk. And when I went to Baltimore, I got a job as a clerk, and then I got a job to be a clerk in the city of Baltimore, for the city of Baltimore. And I was a young man who was healthy, and I enjoyed being with other people, and I made a lot of friends. And of course, I joined with the militia. All of us joined with the militia. And then when in 1774 and 1775, when things got so bad that it looked like war was coming, I quit my job as a clerk and I joined a rifle company. These were professional rifle companies. And almost as soon as I joined the rifle company, we got orders to go to help relieve Boston, because we'd heard about battles at Lexington and Concord up there nearby in Boston. And we knew that the British had taken that city and were abusing that city and taking away the rights of the people in that city. And we wanted to, we objected, of course, to tyranny. All good, honest, honorable men objected to tyranny. And that's what was being done. And so we went up to Boston, up toward Boston. The British were there. And so we submitted ourselves to the command of General George Washington. Now, he wasn't in Boston, of course. The British were in Boston. And so he was in Cambridge, nearby. And I went there and with my group. And the British sailed away. But we stayed there and we drilled and we tried to call ourselves soldiers, and General Washington did the best he could to make soldiers out of us. One day I remember we got up there in the Commons at Cambridge, and he made us all stand up at attention. And he got a man out to read, and he read us the Declaration of Independence, which said no longer we were going to stand up for our rights as Englishmen. We're going to be independent. We're going to stand up for our rights as human beings. Oh, we felt good about it. We felt good about it. And then we heard that the British were coming back. They only gone to Nova Scotia. They didn't go back to England. They just went to Nova Scotia. And then they came on in their ships, and they came at us down toward New York. So we marched down to New York to see if we couldn't fight them, and we tried to fight them. And in the very first battle, I got captured. This was in the battle at Fort Washington. We call it that because of our general. And I'll just tell you, in those days, in the very first days of us trying to oppose the British, our General Washington wasn't a very good general. He never had been a general before. He hadn't been a soldier before. And nobody questioned his bravery. And nobody questioned his energy. It just, he wasn't as good as the others. And so we had to surrender. Some of us did. Thank goodness only a very few of us did. But no, thank goodness, I was one of them that had to surrender. But you see, I had been a lieutenant colonel. And so as an officer, at first they put me in jail. You know, they put us all in a prison camp. But because I was an officer, they gave me freedom. And I was free not to stay in a cell. I still had to stay within certain bounds. But you know what? That meant we were able to walk around and enjoy. But those British, they threw barbs at us. They made jokes about us. And one day I just couldn't take it anymore. And one of those redcoats said to me, "What are you doing here, fella? You see, you're just not any good. Why are you president?" And I said, "I'm here because I want to fight tyranny, and I want to destroy insolence." And he took it wrong. And so he made up a case against me. And he told his superiors that instead of just walking around and abiding by the terms of my capture, that I was really a spy for George Washington, and that I was sending information to Washington. It wasn't true. I wish it were, but it wasn't true. And so they put me back in a cell. I had to share a small room with one other fellow, and that one other fellow, he had checked. His name was Ethan Allen, and he's from up in that over the hill country, away from Massachusetts, in the Green Mountain area. And he had been for a while, you know, in charge of what he liked to call the Green Mountain Boys. And he'd been involved in fighting at Ticonderoga and other places. but he too been captured. So the two of us were there, and we were mistreated in the prison. Mistreated. That was I think that year, sometimes I can't remember. I think that year was 1777, and so we got word in 1778 that there had been a big battle at a place in western New York called Saratoga, and the Americans had won. The Americans had won. General Gates, General Arnold, and some others had fought and had captured the British commander, Burgoyne, one of the best commanders, we thought, and we captured him. And now I know that what happened was we didn't have any place to keep all the prisoners. You know, we didn't have enough jails. We didn't have enough in the way of a prison camp or anything. So there was a lot of trades back and forth. And I got traded for a lieutenant colonel. And I was set free to go back to Maryland again. Didn't have to sign parole. I got traded. Exchange, prisoner exchange, they called that. And so I came back to Maryland. But you know, Maryland needed me. And so did George Washington. He needed every man he could get. So I didn't come back to my job as a clerk. I came back to my job with the rifle company. And I once more was a lieutenant colonel with the rifle company. One of the men from nearby area, you know, it's just right across the river in Delaware. There was a man over there who had organized some Delaware people. He was from Germany, in what they call Bavaria, over there in the Alps in Germany, they tell me. Of course, I never have been there. But his name was DeKalb, and he was a nobleman. And he'd come over with a young Frenchman whom we all met later, and you probably heard about him. His name is Lafayette. And they had come over together, and they had landed down in the South, met one of Lafayette's friends. His father had been one of Lafayette's friends. At any rate, he joined the army too. And so with DeKalb leading some of the people from Delaware, and me and others leading some of the people from Maryland, we made up a nice little unit. And the next thing I knew, we got orders to follow our new general, General Gates. He'd won at Saratoga. George Washington hadn't won anything. And so we followed Gates. And he was sent down to the South because there were some problems down there in South Carolina. I came as adjutant general with General Gates. We came down to South Carolina, and then it turns out that we didn't have very good information. And General Gates wasn't really prepared to fight. And the British were marching up in the area, and the forces sort of bumped into each other right there at Camden in South Carolina, and we had a terrible fight. I wasn't on the front line now because I was with my men, and I was on the third line. And I was ready as a reserve to get in when the battle developed, and we could tell where the weakness was, and I was to go in where the weakness was. And the trouble was, we didn't find the British weakness. They found our weakness. And it was a terrible shambles. It was a terrible shambles. As a matter of fact, a good many people on our side just fled to the battlefield, including General Gates. He got on his horse and he rode all the way back to Charlotte before we could finally gather things. And it left up to me in the third line to try to hold together what was left over. Well, most of the South Carolina men, you know, they're militia men, they threw down their muskets and went home. They vanished into the woods, in the hills. A good many of our men were killed, and it was a terrible blow. They tried to keep it from us, but word got out. You know, Charleston had just surrendered just a few months before, and now, with the army from Charleston gone in surrender, here we were in Camden, and this army was gone in shambles. There wasn't any army anymore. I did my best to hold them together, and we retreated back into North Carolina and waited for another general to come. And George Washington, he's up there in New York, you know. As a matter of fact, he sort of quit fighting up there. The fighting is now in the South. And so he sends a man. His name is Nathaniel Greene. And you know, we've heard about Nathaniel Greene. One of the first things they told me was the man, in his religion, he was a Quaker. Well, I knew Quakers were pacifists. They're not soldiers, they won't fight. And what are they doing? Citizen General was a Quaker. Well, it turned out that Nathaniel Greene was more than that. As a matter of fact, I grew to admire General Nathaniel Greene. I fought with him in several battles. The first one, he'd gotten down there and we put the army, or shreds of the army together, and we got some volunteers, and we fought a battle at Guilford Courthouse up in North Carolina, up near that little crossroads called Greensboro. And we fought what became a typical General Greene battle. And that is, we fought and fought and fought, and we lost. We had to retreat. The British had outshot us and outmaneuvered us. But we did retreat. We didn't run, like we had at Camden. We didn't run. And we were still an army. And we could still be used as an army. And you know, I fought with General Greene in about 5 different places. And every one of the places we fought, we had that same sort of result. And that is, we had to yield the field to the enemy at the end of the day. But still, when we did, we had an orderly retreat. We fought several other places. We fought over at 96. They had a fort, a Star Fort over there that was operated by some of the Britishers with also the Tories. And we thought we were going to take that place. We thought we were going to capture the Star Fort. We even dug a tunnel. We thought we'd get down under the tunnel and we'd set off some gunpowder and blow up what was left of the tunnel, and it would be inside the fort, but we miscalculated it, and we set off the gunpowder, but we didn't get inside the fort. And the British were sending reinforcements under this Lord Rawdon. You know, I was surprised. General Greene wasn't winning battles. I guess you could say he wasn't losing them either. But he wasn't winning battles, but still people came to join him. You would have thought if he was going to be a loser, that folks wouldn't come. But I think the main reason was, and I've been trying to write about it later, you know, I got some of my book over there. Show it to you later, maybe. But what was happening over here was the British were so mean. Not just the British, but the Tories. They not only killed innocent people, but they would go and they would take all the cows, all the pigs, all the calves, all the goats, and leave the people with nothing. They killed men in the presence of their wives. They hanged children in the presence of their parents. They burned down houses. You know, they weren't fighting a war. You know, this is just utter destruction. It's utter destruction. And the people rebelled against that. And that's the reason they joined General Greene and me. With Gates gone, where I had been his adjutant general, I got to be first the second adjutant, and then I was adjutant general for General Greene too. And we fought in several places. I even fought for a while at Cowpens, where we gave the British a licking up there. Not really General Greene giving them a licking, but another fella, tough man named Morgan. But we were still in the field, and we were still getting the British out of the way. We finally figured out what the British were doing. By the time 1781 was over and we were in in the early spring of 1782, we realized that the British were giving up on trying to take all of South Carolina. Now they had the ports. The British always liked to have seaports because they had the biggest navy in the world, and where they could resupply their armies was at a port. Well, they had Savannah. They had a lot of tourists down there in Savannah, and they had Charleston. You know, they captured Charleston. They had Georgetown. They had Wilmington. And so what they were doing was slowly pulling themselves back in the areas of the ports. And of course we followed them as best we could. And we fought a lot of skirmishes along the way. And we got a lot of help from a man whom I had met when he was first up there at Camden. His name was Francis Marion. And when I first met him, it was just before the Battle of Camden. He was a lieutenant colonel in the South Carolina Army, which wasn't much army now. Charleston had surrendered. He had a ragtag bunch, not but about 20. None of them had the uniform. Most of them didn't even have guns, and they didn't have horses. How they gonna get around if they don't have horses? But he reported and said he was a lieutenant colonel, and he reported that to General Gates. And General Gates, who had his hands full with other things, didn't want to bother with this ragtag bunch. In the first place, this guy, Francis Marion, he didn't look like a soldier. He's short, and he's an ugly man, and he was limping. He had a broken ankle. He just barely was able to walk on. And General Gates really wanted to get rid of him. And so I saw Francis Marion, and I saw the men he had with him, and I thought the best thing to do is get rid of this man. So we sent him down to the Williamsburg district, and told him to sort of do what he could along the river, and cut loose all the boats so the British couldn't use the boats in the river. And I've changed my mind about Francis Marion, because while General Greene and I and others were doing the best we could, which wasn't too much, and we were trying to avoid big battles, because we weren't sure we could get replacements if we lost a lot of men. We had to conserve our men. And so we fought a lot of little battles, but not big ones. Francis Marion did the same thing. And it was sort of like some of those mosquitoes that we ran into. Francis Marion, like the mosquito, they just bite and bite and bite, and you slap at them, and you don't ever get rid of them. And the British just slapped at the Americans and slapped at the Americans and never did get rid of them. Lord Rawdon, the British commander, got sick. He was ill, and he had to give up his command. But he was succeeded by a man named Alexander Stewart, who was as bad as some others that we had heard about. The British had a lot of men who went around looting and destroying property like I told you about. And so we had that on our side. People like a guy named Wemyss, and another guy named Tarleton. Tarleton's one that gave a nickname, or what became a nickname to Francis Marion. But we were gradually pushing them south. George Washington would send us some men every now and then, because he wasn't doing much fighting. Up in the north, the British weren't fighting. They were mostly in places like New York. For a while they were in Philadelphia, but New York was the main place. And so George Washington was just over there in Morristown, New Jersey, is where his camp was, and he was just keeping an eye on the British, so he spared some men. One of the men he spared, I got to like very much. He's from Virginia. His name is Lee, Henry Lee. Henry Lee was a Continental officer. I was a Continental officer too. And that meant we had troops that would stick with it. We weren't like militia. Militia can go home anytime they want to. They're sort of part-time, instantaneous volunteers, but they're also instantaneous deserters to go home. And so we used what militia we could, but then, they depended on the continent. And when Henry Lee came down, Henry Lee did a lot of good things. In the first place, as a battlefield commander, he was good. He knew what to do. He brought some people along with him, like William Washington, who was a cavalry unit, could ride his horse everywhere, and his cavalry could move around and find the enemy for us over and over again and tell us where the enemy was headed. William Washington was something. Interesting name. Sounded like George Washington, but he wasn't. He's a different man. That sort of fellow came in. But other thing Henry Lee did, he got along with the militia leaders. And Francis Marion was one of those militia leaders, but Francis Marion also been in the Continental. So he called himself a general, but that's because he was in South Carolina. He's a South Carolina general. He's a colonel in the Continental Army. Matter of fact, he's a lieutenant colonel. But anyway, Henry Lee got along with him. Didn't much get along with that man Symp. Sumter was a man on his own, and he sort of followed his own dreams and other things too. But Francis Marion was one of these hit and run fellows, and it just bothered. It's like those mosquitoes bothering the British. We finally caught up with Alexander Stewart and his men and surprised them down at Utah Springs. You know, Alexander Stewart, he was wanting to hold on to as much property as he could, but he had trouble supplying his troops. He realized he was in unfriendly territory. The natives would come in and say they wanted to fight for the British, and then they'd give him wrong directions, and his troops go marching off to the north when they should have been going to the south. They took the wrong road here and there, and they were directed to cross the river at certain places, which wasn't a ford, you know, and some of them would drown in the river. And he was just having a lot of trouble, and we caught him in Utah Springs. General Lee caught him. It had been it was September, hot September, the hottest day, and I don't know why the mosquitoes answered the bell, but they came to our side that day, and the mosquitoes gave the British as much trouble as we did, and we had a big battle. Didn't usually have a big battle, but this time we did. They were plotting what to do, and I said to General Green, I've been your faithful servant, I've been a commander back here, and you keep me on the third line or the second line. So he gave out the orders that day at Utah Springs, and he said, let Williams and his men charge first and clear the field with bayonets. Bayonets! We usually didn't use the bayonets. That's what an army man does. But he gave us the right to do it. And we passed that word on to people like Francis Marion and his soldiers. We didn't know whether they were going to act like soldiers or whether they were going to act like bandits. That's what they usually did. But that day in Utah Springs, we led the charge, the 6th Maryland. I was at the command. And I did this remembering my friend DeKalb, who had gotten killed in Camden. And I sort of dedicated in my heart this battle to the Baron DeKalb. And we charged into those British, and we frightened them at first, and we scared them, we spread panic, and they ran. They broke and ran. And here we were, some Continentals like my people, some state people here and there. There was Henry Lee over there, and William Washington on his horses, and Francis Marion. Francis Marion's men fought like soldiers that day, like they had been trained, and were some of the best kind. I never saw anybody fight with the kind of troops he had to fight so well as he did. And that's what's caused me to change my mind. Well, I guess you know what happened to us was we overran the British base. And when our people got there, we found all sorts of supplies. Hey, they had shoes. A lot of our people didn't have shoes. And so the men stopped to put a few shoes in their knapsacks. And they not only had shoes, but they had shirts, they had clothing, they also had some ammunition, and they had a lot of rum. And we got into the rum, and we were more concerned there. And the British, seeing what was happening, and I will say the British had a top flight man there, not just Stewart, but a man named Marjoribanks, John Marjoribanks. I learned his first name later. And he rallied the troops in a house behind a brick wall. And as our troops got confused and our charges weren't as good as they were, Major Banks stopped us. I saw William Washington go down. His horse got hit. His horse fell, sort of pinned him under the horse. Washington was wounded too. As a matter of fact, I saw a British officer come up with his bayonet, and he poised his bayonet as though he was going to put it right through Washington. And Major Banks, seeing what was happening, stopped him. But Washington was carried away as a captive that day, and he died 2 days later. Major Banks later got killed. It was tough fighting. It was tough fighting. We lost over 300 men dead. 300 killed that day. The British didn't have that many. The British didn't lose as many as we did. But what they lost was the spirit. And what they lost was the advantage. And because after our charge failed and they counterattacked, guess who had to leave the field? Once more, General Greene has to leave the field. So it looks like he lost again, but he didn't. His army retired. I helped retire him. I was in charge of the rear guard again. We retired in order, and we were ready to turn and fight if necessary. But Stuart and the British, they didn't have any more heart for the fight. As a matter of fact, that's the last big battle. That's not the last battle, but it's the last big battle they had. Utah Springs, crucial battle. After the Utah Springs, we came back north. And as you know, Alexander Stuart eventually got his men back to Charleston. And the British sent 300 of their ships to take away some Tories who decided they'd rather leave America, since they were already marked as Tories, than to try to stay in Charleston. And we let them get away. General Greene marched in and captured Charleston, took it over. And I came back up here to Maryland. You know, that's 10 years ago. 10 years ago. And I've been here. I came back to Williamsport. I still didn't want to be a farmer, but my brother died and there was the land, it was mine. And so I began to farm. I got some folks to help me farming. And then down in Baltimore, the people there who knew what sort of career I had, they created a new post for me called a collector of the port. Well, Baltimore had to have a collector, you know. The British had been collecting, and now the British were gone. Somebody's got to be in charge of collecting the duties. The new duties, you know. American, not British duties, American duties. And so I became a collector of the port, which meant once more I was keeping books. And you know, I like doing that. I got married. Hadn't been married before. Married Mary Smith, good American name. And we've been married for the 10 years that I've been back. We got 4 children. You probably heard them out there making all that noise. But I've been worried because, you know, every now and then my joints won't work and I'm having to carry this cane. My health's not what it used to be. I had 2 contacts with George Washington. He remembered me. At least he said he did in his letters. The first letter I wrote him, I wrote him and told him that I had heard that the Congress was going to build a capital city. And we were going to have a new city. The capital wasn't going to be in New York or Philadelphia anymore. We were going to build a new capital, and several states had offered land free. And so I offered Williamsport. I wrote him and said, you can have the land here. I really didn't want to be a farm. It's on the Potomac River, and it's in a beautiful mountain country over here in western Maryland. It'll be an ideal place. And it's not right on the water. If we ever had an attack from somebody, they'd have to land first and then march there. But then General Washington, he's now President Washington. President Washington decided on some land that was right near his own property. on the Potomac River, and so that didn't work. The other contact I had with was George Washington. He wrote me a letter, and he said in the letter that he'd had resignations, but he wanted to create an army, and he wondered if I would go back into the army again as a brigadier general and be the number 2 man in the American Army, that's second in command of the American Army. It was a real honor. And I thought about it for a while, and then I wrote him back what was really in my heart. And I said to him that I really had no desire for the post, and that my health was not good. And so I had to decline. Instead, when the state of Maryland offered me a post as a justice on their court, I accepted that, and so I've been something of a judge. So I've been in comfortable circumstances as far as finances are concerned. The farm is doing well, and I'm a collector of the port for the United States, and I'm a judge from Maryland. And so I ought to be content, but I'm not. And the reason I'm not is I've got this feeling, sometimes I think I feel almost like I'm paralyzed. We're married, and last spring, what is it? This September? Yeah, this September. Yeah, I guess it was in May. We decided that we would go down to Baltimore and catch the ship and take us a cruise. And we took a cruise down to the Caribbean. But it didn't do any good. And I came back feeling as tired as ever. It's just like I'm tired now. And I look at this Potomac River and this lovely thing, and I remember the goodness of life to me, and how many blessings I've had. And I wonder about the future. We've got 4 little kids. And I've got jobs that won't bring in any money if I'm dead. And so I don't know what's going to happen to Mary. But I don't know what's going to happen to the United States.